April 11, 1945. The decision was made on a telephone line, not a map table. Lieutenant General William Simpson stood on the western bank of the Elbe River, binoculars lowered, staring down an empty highway that led straight to Berlin. His Ninth Army had crossed the river at multiple points. Bridgeheads were secure. Resistance had collapsed. German soldiers were surrendering in groups, some in entire units, abandoning weapons and walking west with their hands raised. The front had dissolved into movement without opposition. Simpson understood exactly what he was looking at. 50 miles of open road. No organized defense. No meaningful reserves. 2 days of driving, perhaps less, and American forces would reach the German capital. He did not call to debate. He called to request authority. He picked up the field telephone and reached General Omar Bradley at 12th Army Group headquarters. Simpson spoke plainly. His army could reach Berlin within 24 hours. The road was open. The enemy was finished. He requested permission to advance immediately. There was silence on the line. Bradley did not answer at once. He relayed the request upward, to Supreme Allied Headquarters, to Dwight Eisenhower. When Bradley returned, his voice carried none of Simpson's urgency. The answer was no. The order was explicit. The Ninth Army was to halt at the Elbe. No further advance eastward. Berlin was not the objective. Simpson challenged the order once, briefly, professionally. He restated the facts. German resistance no longer existed in front of him. His formations were intact, supplied, and ready. The war could be ended by direct action. The response did not change. These were Eisenhower's orders. Hold the line. Do not advance. To the south, George Patton received the same instruction. His Third Army, equally capable of pushing east, was directed away from Berlin entirely. Both commanders complied. Neither believed the order reflected the reality in front of them. The decision did not occur on the riverbank. It was not shaped by the terrain, the enemy, or the condition of the American armies. It was issued from headquarters, informed by intelligence briefings, alliance considerations, and strategic caution. The order froze the front in place. The Elbe became a boundary by directive rather than force. Across the river, the road to Berlin remained empty. What existed at the Elbe in mid-April was not a gamble. It was a fully formed operational opportunity, measurable in distance, time, and force ratios. The Ninth Army had crossed the river intact. Not a probing raid, not a fragile bridgehead, but multiple crossings secured by infantry, armor, and engineers working in sequence. The river, which German planners once assumed would be a natural defensive barrier, had already failed in its final role. Once the crossings were established, there was nothing behind them designed to stop a mechanized army. German command cohesion west of Berlin no longer functioned. Divisional headquarters had ceased issuing coordinated orders. Units were operating independently or not at all. Communications were fragmented, fuel was exhausted, and ammunition stocks were either abandoned or expended. Armored formations that could have delayed an advance had already been destroyed, immobilized, or redirected east toward the Soviets. The remaining German forces in central Germany consisted largely of exhausted infantry, Volkssturm detachments, and retreating administrative units. The terrain imposed no penalty for speed. From the Elbe to Berlin, the primary highway network was intact. Bridges remained standing. No layered defensive belts had been prepared. There were no significant urban choke points until the outskirts of the capital itself. The route favored movement, not defense, and American doctrine was built precisely for rapid exploitation of such conditions. Air superiority was absolute. Allied aircraft controlled the sky continuously, not just during daylight hours. Reconnaissance flights confirmed the absence of prepared German positions along the axis of advance. Any attempt to assemble a blocking force would have been detected and dismantled before it could solidify. Close air support was available on demand, not as a scarce asset, but as a routine extension of ground maneuver. Logistics posed no immediate constraint. Fuel depots had been pushed forward deliberately to support continued movement. Ammunition stocks exceeded projected consumption for a rapid advance. Maintenance units were operating close behind combat formations, and the road network could sustain traffic without bottlenecks. The Ninth Army was not outrunning its supply lines. It was operating within them. Numerically, the imbalance was decisive. Simpson commanded roughly 300,000 men. These were not depleted formations at the end of a long pursuit, but cohesive divisions with functional command structures. To the south, Patton's Third Army could have supported or paralleled the advance, further reducing any risk of German regrouping. Against this, German forces in the sector could not assemble even a symbolic defense without stripping the Eastern Front, something no longer feasible. Morale completed the equation. German soldiers were not preparing to fight for Berlin against the Americans. They were trying to avoid the Soviets. Entire units moved westward deliberately, discarding equipment and seeking surrender. This was not resistance waiting to be broken. It was an enemy already disengaging. Every mile the Americans advanced would have generated additional surrenders, not additional combat. Urban fighting in Berlin itself was a known risk, but even that risk was constrained. The German leadership had already begun evacuating. Civil authority had collapsed. The city's defenses were oriented east, toward the Red Army. An American approach from the west would not have encountered a prepared urban defense system. It would have arrived before one could be organized. From a military standpoint, the opportunity was not speculative. It did not rely on optimistic assumptions or perfect timing. It relied on conditions already achieved: enemy collapse, logistical readiness, air dominance, and maneuver space. The operation required no deviation from established American doctrine. It required only continuation. There was no credible scenario in which a rapid American advance from the Elbe would have been stopped short of Berlin by German forces. Delay would not have reduced risk. Delay could only eliminate the opportunity. The battlefield had already delivered its verdict. What remained was permission to act. Simpson and Patton did not arrive at the Elbe improvising. Their assessment was the product of preparation already completed and validated in motion. For weeks before the river was reached, both commanders had adjusted their operational posture for exploitation, not consolidation. The advance across central Germany had not been a sequence of set-piece battles. It had been a controlled pursuit designed to preserve momentum while bypassing resistance that no longer mattered. That method only worked because command discipline, logistics, and reconnaissance were already synchronized. Simpson's reports to Bradley were not optimistic impressions. They were confirmations. Intelligence summaries showed German command nodes dissolving faster than they could be replaced. Signals intelligence indicated that orders were no longer propagating beyond regimental level, if at all. Prisoners provided the same picture repeatedly, without prompting. They were not waiting for instructions. They were looking for a way out. Preparation inside Ninth Army reflected that reality. Engineers had already rehearsed river crossings under fire and executed them without incident. Bridging assets were allocated in advance, not requested in crisis. Armor and mechanized infantry were kept forward, not pulled back for rest. The assumption was continuity. Movement was expected, not paused. Patton's Third Army mirrored the same logic. Fuel shortages earlier in the campaign had forced hard decisions, and Patton had learned from them. By April, stockpiles were forward positioned specifically to prevent another operational pause. Maintenance units moved with combat formations. Orders emphasized speed and bypass, not clearance and occupation. The aim was to keep the enemy from reforming by denying him time. Air-ground coordination was already mature. Forward air controllers were embedded with advancing units. Reconnaissance flights operated continuously along likely axes of German movement. When resistance appeared, it was neutralized without halting the column. The system did not require deliberation at higher headquarters. It functioned automatically because it had been practiced under pressure. Neither commander underestimated risk. Both accounted for the possibility of localized resistance or sudden political constraint. Contingency plans existed for German attempts to form blocking positions or to trigger urban fighting prematurely. Reserve units were identified and positioned not to defend the rear, but to exploit success or contain anomalies. This was not recklessness. It was structured confidence. Crucially, Both commanders understood the psychological dimension of the moment. German morale was not simply low, it had inverted. Fear was no longer directed at the advancing Americans, but at the approaching Soviets. This altered the operational environment fundamentally. Surrender was not the end of resistance. It was the objective of the enemy. That reality reduced risk faster than any firepower advantage. Simpson's credibility rested on consistency. His assessments during the campaign had aligned with outcomes. He had not overextended his forces. He had not misread German intent. His staff analysis matched battlefield results repeatedly. When he stated that the road to Berlin was open, it reflected a pattern already proven across hundreds of miles. Patton's reputation for aggression did not obscure his operational judgment. He had been restrained before when conditions demanded it. He had halted when logistics required it. His insistence now was not impulsive. It was based on the same calculation he had made throughout the campaign. Momentum preserved lives by shortening exposure, not by increasing it. Both commanders recognized that Berlin was not merely symbolic. It was a command vacuum waiting to be filled. Occupying it would collapse remaining German coordination west of the Oder and clarify surrender conditions immediately. Delay would not strengthen the enemy. It would only determine who arrived first. Their warnings were procedural, not emotional. They were delivered through formal channels, supported by intelligence, logistics data, and operational forecasts. No appeal was made to prestige or personal ambition. The argument was utilitarian. In the war where it could be ended fastest, they had done what commanders are expected to do. They assessed the environment, prepared their forces, and presented a feasible plan grounded in observable reality. Their role ended when the decision moved beyond military logic. The warning was issued clearly and early. It did not require hindsight to validate it. It required only permission to act. The order to halt at the Elbe did not emerge from uncertainty on the ground. It emerged from pressures that had little to do with the armies that stood ready to move. At Supreme Headquarters, Eisenhower was no longer evaluating a battlefield in isolation. He was managing an alliance at the moment when victory was imminent and post-war reality was beginning to intrude. Every decision now carried consequences beyond the defeat of Germany itself. Berlin was not simply a military objective. It was a political prize embedded in agreements already made and expectations already set. The most immediate influence was intelligence. For months, Allied analysts had circulated reports of a German national redoubt in the Alpine regions of southern Germany and Austria. According to these assessments, senior Nazi leadership intended to abandon Berlin and conduct a prolonged resistance from mountainous terrain, stocked with supplies and defended by elite formations. The scenario promised attritional warfare, high casualties, and no decisive endpoint. Eisenhower took these reports seriously. His experience in Italy had demonstrated how effectively German forces could exploit mountains, weather, and prepare defenses to stall superior armies. The idea of fighting another Italy, this time deeper in Europe and after 6 years of war, was intolerable. If such a redoubt existed and was allowed to mature, it threatened to extend the conflict indefinitely. The credibility of the intelligence mattered less than its implication. Eisenhower did not need absolute certainty. He needed to avoid the risk of being wrong. A push on Berlin that ignored the southern threat could be judged, in hindsight, as reckless if resistance flared in the Alps. Preventing that possibility became a strategic priority. Alliance politics compounded the calculation. The Soviet Union was advancing on Berlin from the east with enormous force and enormous losses. At Yalta, occupation zones had already been discussed. Berlin lay deep within the area the Soviets expected to dominate. An American dash to the city risked more than friction. It risked confrontation at the moment when unity was most publicly required. Eisenhower's authority rested not only on rank, but on trust. British trust, Soviet trust, and political trust in Washington. A unilateral move toward Berlin could be interpreted as a deliberate attempt to outmaneuver the Soviets at the last moment, undermining agreements that had preserved cooperation throughout the war. Even if no shots were exchanged, The symbolic breach could poison the post-war settlement before it began. Institutional culture reinforced restraint. Supreme headquarters had been built to coordinate deliberate, phased operations across multiple national forces. It was not designed to sanction sudden exploitation based on local opportunity. The system rewarded predictability and punished deviation. Frontline initiative was valued until it threatened strategic coherence. Eisenhower himself embodied that balance. He was not a battlefield tactician. He was an organizer, a negotiator, and a manager of competing interests. His greatest strength had been preventing Allied unity from fracturing under pressure. That strength now constrained him. A decision that satisfied military logic but destabilized political equilibrium was, in his framework, unacceptable. There were also domestic considerations. Casualties still mattered. Every American death in April 1945 carried political weight disproportionate to earlier losses. The public expected the war to end cleanly. Any spike in casualties at the finish line would be scrutinized relentlessly. Berlin promised fighting, even if brief. The Alpine Redoubt, if real, promised far worse. Eisenhower chose the threat he could justify addressing. The views of subordinate commanders did not alter the equation. Simpson and Patton evaluated opportunity. Eisenhower evaluated risk. The difference was structural, not personal. He was not dismissing their competence. He was overriding it deliberately. Even dissent within his own staff did not reverse course. Some officers questioned the redoubt intelligence. Others acknowledged the operational feasibility of reaching Berlin. But feasibility was no longer decisive. Eisenhower's responsibility extended beyond winning battles to shaping the peace. In that context, Berlin's capture by American forces offered diminishing returns. The halt order was issued with clarity precisely because it was not provisional. It was not intended to be revisited. The armies were to stop, redirect, and execute a different priority. Once issued, the order became policy, and policy became fact on the ground. The overrule at the Elbe was not the result of hesitation. It was the result of a conscious hierarchy of values. Political stability outweighed operational opportunity. Alliance cohesion outweighed tactical advantage. Avoiding a hypothetical future war outweighed ending the present one a few days sooner. From Eisenhower's position, the decision reduced uncertainty. From the riverbank, it defied logic. Both perspectives were accurate within their own frames. The system had spoken, and once it did, no amount of open road could override it. Once the order was issued, the consequences unfolded immediately and without drama. There was no battle to mark the moment. There was only stillness where momentum had been. The Ninth Army consolidated its positions along the Elbe. Units that had expected to move forward instead dug in, secured crossings they no longer needed, and waited. The highway east remained empty. No German counterattack came to test the decision. None was coming. German soldiers understood the implication faster than Allied headquarters did. The river hardened into a boundary overnight. West of it, American units accepted surrenders with minimal formality. East of it, the Red Army continued its advance with relentless force. Between the two lay a narrowing corridor of choice, measured in hours, not days. Entire German formations redirected themselves toward the American lines. Officers ordered weapons destroyed rather than issued. Vehicles were abandoned in ditches to move faster on foot. White flags appeared improvised from bedding, bandages, anything that could be seen from a distance. Discipline did not collapse into chaos. It collapsed into intent. The intent was surrender to the West. The halt transformed surrender from a military act into a race. German soldiers who might have laid down arms along the road to Berlin now had to reach the Elbe before Soviet units closed the distance. Some succeeded. Many did not. The difference was not courage or resistance. It was geography and timing. On the eastern approaches to Berlin, the fighting intensified. The city became what it had not yet been when Simpson stood on the riverbank, a killing ground. The German units defending it fought not for victory, but to delay long enough for others to escape west. Civilians fled where they could. Many could not. The American armies watched the outcome from a fixed line. They heard reports, intercepted signals, saw columns of smoke rising beyond their reach. They did not intervene. They could not, by order. Patton's Third Army felt the consequence differently. Redirected south, it advanced rapidly through Bavaria and into Austria, hunting a threat that did not materialize. The feared Alpine redoubt dissolved under inspection. There were no fortified complexes, no elite formations preparing a last stand. German units encountered their surrendered as readily as those elsewhere, often surprised to find Americans instead of Soviets. Time exposed the asymmetry. The Americans faced little resistance where they were sent. The Soviets absorbed enormous casualties, taking ground that might have fallen without organized defense had pressure been applied from both sides. The war ended not later, but differently. Berlin fell to the Red Army alone. Its capture defined not just the end of the war, but the beginning of a new order. The city became a symbol of conquest rather than coordination. Occupation zones hardened into political realities. The presence that mattered most was the one that arrived first. For German soldiers, the consequence was personal and irreversible. Those who crossed into American custody were processed, disarmed, and housed under the rules of a conventional surrender. Many would return home within years. Those taken by the Soviets entered a system that did not distinguish between degrees of guilt. Prisoners vanished into camps, labor battalions, or unmarked graves. Survival became statistical. The Elbe was not intended to be a moral boundary. It became one by default. The order that fixed the line determined outcomes no battlefield decision could reverse afterward. At the institutional level, the halt reinforced a pattern. Frontline initiative had limits, and those limits were political. Commanders could identify opportunity, prepare forces, and present plans, but final authority rested where military logic competed with diplomatic calculation. In April 1945, diplomacy prevailed. The cost was not measured in Allied casualties avoided, though that justification was cited. It was measured in leverage surrendered. By the time Allied leaders met again, the map had already been drawn by movement, not negotiation. The Americans had respected the line they were told to hold. The Soviets occupied what lay beyond it. No official reckoning followed. There were no courts of inquiry, no formal rebukes, no acknowledgments of opportunity lost. The decision was absorbed into the narrative of orderly victory. The war had ended. That was sufficient. Yet the consequences persisted. Germany's division traced back to that river. Berlin's isolation traced back to that pause. The human outcomes, unequal and enduring, traced back to which army was allowed to advance and which was not. The battlefield had offered a conclusion shaped by speed and collapse. The command decision replaced it with one shaped by restraint and alignment. Neither reversed the outcome of the war. One defined the outcome of the peace. By stopping at the Elbe, the Allies did not prolong the conflict. They redistributed its final costs. Those costs were paid not in days of fighting, but in years of captivity, in borders fixed by occupation, and in a capital city claimed by force rather than consensus. The road to Berlin remained unused. What followed instead could not be undone. The post-war record stripped the decision of its protective context. Once the fighting ended, evidence replaced fear, and speculation gave way to documentation. Interrogations conducted by Allied intelligence in the months after Germany's surrender produced a consistent account from German officers who had commanded forces west of Berlin. There were no reserves positioned to defend the city from an American advance. No coherent plan existed for a Western defense. Units that might have been assembled had already disintegrated or were oriented entirely against the Soviet approach. Several senior officers stated plainly that an American thrust from the Elbe would have encountered little organized resistance until the outskirts of the capital itself. Captured documents confirmed what frontline commanders had already reported. Orders from higher German headquarters had ceased to function as operational guidance. Communications were fragmented. Supply systems had collapsed. The ability to coordinate defense beyond isolated pockets no longer existed. Berlin's defenses were improvised, directional, and incomplete. They were designed to delay the Red Army, not repel a second major force from the west. The Alpine Redoubt, which had dominated Eisenhower's strategic calculus, did not survive scrutiny. As American units pushed into Bavaria and Austria, they found no fortified complex, no stockpiled resources capable of sustaining prolonged resistance, and no elite formations preparing for a final stand. What they encountered were the same broken units found elsewhere, retreating or surrendering without cohesion. Post-war intelligence reviews concluded that the redoubt had been a construct assembled from misinterpreted movements, exaggerated reports, and German deception efforts that had outlived their usefulness. Memoirs written by Allied commanders reflected restrained frustration rather than open condemnation. Simpson described the halt as a collision between military reality and higher obligation. He did not dispute Eisenhower's authority. He did not argue that the decision was irrational within its political framework. He stated only that the operational conditions on the ground had justified immediate exploitation. Patton was less guarded in private writings, though he remained careful in official accounts. He described Berlin as the objective that mattered most and acknowledged that the decision to abandon it had nothing to do with German strength. His criticism focused on outcome rather than intent. The war had ended, but the peace had been shaped elsewhere. Eisenhower's own post-war explanations emphasized responsibility. He acknowledged that American forces could likely have reached Berlin first. He maintained that doing so would have cost lives unnecessarily and endangered Allied unity. He framed the decision as one made to prevent a future conflict rather than to win the present one more decisively. The explanation was consistent, disciplined, and incomplete. Subsequent historical analysis narrowed the gap. Scholars with access to full intelligence archives concluded that the casualty projections used to justify restraint had been overstated. The resistance encountered by the Red Army was not evidence of what Americans would have faced. It was evidence of timing and orientation. The city became lethal because it was defended alone, under siege, against an enemy that expected no compromise. The human record was harder to reconcile. Prisoner-of-war data revealed stark disparities in survival rates between German soldiers captured by Western forces and those taken by the Soviets in April and May of 1945. The difference was not marginal. It was structural. Length of captivity, mortality, and post-war reintegration diverged sharply based on where surrender occurred. The Elbe, fixed by order, determined those outcomes. Diplomatic correspondence from the immediate post-war period confirmed that Allied leaders understood the leverage they had relinquished. Control of Berlin translated directly into influence over Germany's political reconstruction. The Western Allies negotiated from outside the capital. The Soviets did not. Occupation zones hardened into borders faster than anyone publicly admitted at the time. No official revision followed. The decision remained unchallenged in formal histories produced by Allied commands. It was described as prudent, stabilizing, and consistent with coalition obligations. The absence of catastrophe was taken as proof of correctness. What the record ultimately showed was not error, but trade-off. A military opportunity was exchanged for political predictability. A swift conclusion was exchanged for a managed one. The war ended on schedule, but its ending was shaped unevenly. With hindsight, the halt at the Elbe appears neither accidental nor misunderstood. It was deliberate, informed by the fears of continuation rather than the realities of collapse. The documents leave no ambiguity about intent. They leave only the consequences to speak for themselves. The case closed without reversal. The decision stood. The evidence remained. The decision at the Elbe resolved nothing on the battlefield. It resolved everything beyond it. American armies stood in position to end the war by direct action. They were stopped by instruction, not resistance. The German capital fell days later to a different force, under different conditions, with different consequences. That outcome was not accidental. It followed directly from a single order. Eisenhower's halt preserved alliance stability and avoided a confrontation that leadership feared more than delay. It also surrendered initiative at the moment it mattered most. The choice was not between victory and defeat. It was between control and concession. Frontline commanders were correct in their assessment. The enemy west of Berlin had collapsed. The terrain favored speed. Logistics were sufficient. Morale had inverted. The opportunity required no improvisation and no extraordinary risk. It required continuation. That continuation was denied. The justification rested on threats that did not materialize and dangers that could not be measured. The Alpine redoubt dissolved under contact. The feared prolongation of war never occurred. What did occur was a redistribution of outcomes. Berlin became a Soviet prize. Germany became divided. Surrender became a race rather than a conclusion. The consequences were human, political, and permanent. Soldiers lived or disappeared based on which side of a river they reached. Influence over post-war Germany was determined by presence, not negotiation. The final shape of Europe was fixed not by treaties, but by where armies were allowed to stand still. This was not a failure of intelligence alone, nor a failure of courage. It was the predictable result of a system that elevated political equilibrium over operational reality. The battlefield delivered clarity. The command room overruled it. The case closes without ambiguity. The halt at the Elbe was militarily unnecessary and strategically decisive. It did not change who won the war. It determined who controlled its ending. This channel documents decisions where wars are shaped before the fighting begins or after it no longer matters. Subscribe to continue examining how outcomes are forged away from the front. Leave a comment to register the moment when the war ended in motion, but the peace was decided at a standstill.